Hello everyone and welcome back to Quickflicks. My name is Nicholas Jennings and today we're going to be taking a look at two offerings from streaming services that came out this past weekend, Godmothered and Mank. So let's start off with Mank because this is probably the more interesting one that everyone seems to be talking about. There are some people that are saying it's boring, some people that are saying it's art, and honestly, I kind of find both of the arguments to be pretty valid, but anyway, let's get into what this movie is about. David Fincher is back in the director's seat once again after he did movies like The Social Network and TV shows such as Mindhunter, which is one of my favorite TV shows, by the way. But anyways, he's back in doing this biopic of sorts about the writer, Herman Mankiewicz, who did Citizen Kane. This movie isn't necessarily about the making of Citizen Kane, but more rather the life of the writer of Citizen Kane and how Hollywood seemed to be very against socialists, I guess. I'd say for the most part this movie is a little all over the place because it doesn't really necessarily know what it wants to be about. Does it want to be about the making of Citizen Kane? Does it want to be a biopic about Herman Mankiewicz? Does it want to discuss the inner workings of old school Hollywood and maybe contrast it with what's going on in today's world? And it doesn't necessarily do any of those things. Like, yeah, they kind of call attention to some things that were happening at the time, and when you comparatively reflect on what happened then and what's happening now, some things kind of match up. But for the most part, it just didn't seem like it had enough narrative cohesion to really bring all this substance together. Like, yeah, this movie does point to a lot of issues in Hollywood of the time. It was pretty much anti-Soviet, it was anti-socialist. You can find plenty of examples in old Hollywood, especially in places like Walt Disney's animation studio, where there was union busting. A lot of the big studio heads were really much against it. And I did not expect to actually be talking about this type of subject in a review about a movie about a guy who helped write and create one of cinema's most beloved films of all time. But here we are, I guess. But anyway, Gary Oldman plays Herman Mankiewicz, and his performance is actually pretty decent. But I also feel like he's a little too old for him, because even in the film itself, it points to him dying at the age of 55, 11 years later. So when you compare the age of Gary Oldman to what this person was like at the time, he was already well into his 30s, and Gary Oldman is not that old. I would have probably casted a younger person, but I understand why they needed to have Gary Oldman as the main character to help drive people to go see the movie. But to be honest, I mean, he did a good job. I'll say that. He did a good job with a script that doesn't really feel like it's all there, but it's good. It's a good performance. And then you get Amanda Seyfried as this character who's an actress who wants to be all these different things, and it was pretty good, I guess. She did a pretty good job. She's a good actress. Again, I think every single actor in this movie did a pretty decent job. I'd say the directing is pretty good. It's very old school Hollywood in a lot of ways. They use rear screen projections sometimes when they're doing the driving sequences, which makes it look like it's part of the whole aesthetic of when Citizen Kane was made. I think my only problem really is the script, because again, it feels like it's so disjointed everywhere that it doesn't necessarily have enough in there themed, weaved in there thematically that makes it really strong. Like, it just, at the beginning, for example, it seems at the beginning they kind of want to paint Orson Welles as this villain figure. Like, he comes into Mank's office, or not his office, but his hospital room towards the beginning of the movie. And he's like, oh, we got some work to do. And he's kind of positioned as being the villain. And he even laughs like a villain. But it isn't even until the very end of the movie that they actually have any interaction with each other. And that's kind of sad, because I'm not entirely sure what the whole point of setting him up to be a villain when it's clearly obvious throughout the rest of the movie that it's making it out to be that his own problems got into the way, and that he himself got fired because of whatever the fuck he did. Like, he did so much in this movie that it kind of negates this whole angle of, oh, Orson Welles was, an evil bad guy. I don't know, I just can't get into this angle. But again, this movie does have its strong points. It looks good, it looks crisp. I mean, it's shot well, it's directed well, sounds pretty interesting. There's some fun points about, like, Hollywood of the time, and you could reflexively, like, compare it to today, even though the film doesn't really do that. I don't know, man. This movie does not work much, and that's kind of upsetting because I am a huge David Fincher fan. I love Zodiac. I loved Social Network. Panic Room is really good. Mindhunter is really great. The only one that I've never really liked from David Fincher was Alien 3, but, that's the only one. Mank, to me, just is a little bit of a disappointment, especially, I'd say the only real way you could get some more enjoyment out of this movie is if you've watched Citizen Kane, which most people really haven't because they don't care about Citizen Kane. It's a movie that's become kind of irrelevant over the years, but you still should watch it at least once. All I'm saying here is that Mank is a well-directed, well-polished, stylistic film, but doesn't necessarily have the thematic weight that it should, and it's kind of upsetting to me. And also, this film really boasts the whole stereotype that, a tortured artist needs to always be drinking all the time in order to find brilliance. And I find that really lazy. Even if Mank himself in real life was an alcoholic, I'm kind of tired of movies having this, creative genius having to have, like, beer and alcohol and substances in order to be a brilliant person. I think that, to me, is just overblown, and I'm not sure if anyone else has the same feelings about that whole thing. So in the end, I'm going to give Mank a C. And flipping on over to Disney Plus is Godmothered. Godmothered follows Eleanor, a brand new fairy godmother in training, as she lives in what is called the Motherland. It's a place where fairy godmothers do their training, and they find out that secretly the head of organization of sorts that trains fairies is closing down because the world is losing hope. Fortunately enough, Eleanor finds one last wish that she could probably make come true, and she decides to go through a portal to head to Boston. And this is where we get to our main character, Mackenzie, a person who works at a news broadcasting station who has 2 daughters, and Eleanor finds that the person that she was trying to meet was Mackenzie, but she's grown way too old. And so now she has to figure out how to make her have a happily ever after in this world that has kind of moved past the whole notion of happily ever afters, or at least what we commonly think of as happily ever afters. This movie is actually at times brilliant, but at other times pretty conventional. And this movie has kind of the same-ish structure as Enchanted, where you have a person who's like a princess that, like, follows a lot of the traditional, like, Disney tropes and stereotypes, and they kind of poke fun at some of them, but it also is kind of its own sort of thing of a fairy tale of sorts, and Godmother kind of fits in that whole angle. But I think this movie actually has a pretty decent grasp of what it's trying to do. There's various points in this movie where it understands what it's trying to make fun of, but at the same time, it also leaves room for bringing in some nuance to it. And let's start with Eleanor, for example. Eleanor is a character that I personally like. She's very cheerful and bubbly, and at first she's trying to do this thing to try to save the motherland from closing down forever, but there's a point in the movie where, I kind of thought to myself, okay, maybe this is kind of wrong for her to do it, and the movie actually acknowledges that what she's doing is kind of wrong. And there comes a point in the movie where, towards the very end, where they kind of acknowledge all the things that are wrong with this concept of this whole happily ever after thing. The whole basic setup is that in various fairy tales, there's like Cinderella, for instance. She's a woman who is trapped up in her aunt's apartment, right? And she can't go to the ball. And here's the formula. So you give her a new gown, hook her up with like a prince, and then they fall in love, and that's the end of the story. This movie gives that a little bit more nuance. There's a lot that is put into the movie in terms of the writing, in terms of the character Mackenzie, played by Isa Fisher, who does a really good job at really discerning why this concept of happily ever after is kind of bogus. And I like it. I really do. In some ways, it also kind of reminds me of Isn't It Romantic? With Rebel Wilson. It kind of reminds me of that at certain points, but I really like this movie. I do think this will be kind of a Christmas classic to a lot of people in the future, in the same way that the Santa Claus movies are the same way. It's not like a great movie or anything. There's like it's not great, but I do think the performances here are good. I think some of the deconstruction here is kind of cool. I like the fact that, you know, instead of trying to go for a happily ever after, which is usually unrealistic and can sometimes be very toxic, it goes for a more, hey, you know, maybe our focus should be on trying to be happy rather than just looking for that end game of being happily ever after. And I like that angle, and it brings more to the table than just, hey, let's get these two together and married. And that's actually what I was fearing in this movie up until that point, because there was another character that was introduced into the movie that works alongside with Mackenzie at the workplace, and even his last name is Prince, which is kind of hilarious. And and you know, for the longest time, I was like, okay, clearly Eleanor is going to try to get them together to get married and do their thing, because they got similar backgrounds, they got all this stuff, but no, actually it goes for a much different thing, and they don't even cop that out in this movie. They don't do like a time jump thing where it's like, oh yeah, well now they're married after like a year or two, and like, I like that. I think I like that a lot, and I hope that more pieces of media actually take the message of this movie to heart, because not every movie that has some sort of romantic angle to it needs to have like an actual like marriage to it, that needs to have some sort of dating relationship. Sometimes people could just be friends, and I think that is in of itself a good thing, especially in this movie. I really enjoyed it. I like the writing of this movie. The directing, though, I think some of the camera shots and whatnot really remind me of like a Lifetime original movie at times, but at other points it's like, yeah, this is kind of like a Disney movie. It has sometimes green screen backgrounds, but it's a movie. It's a movie made for Disney Plus, and I could not be more happier with the movie. It's not totally great, and I think the one thing that doesn't necessarily work for me, and it's pretty much a problem with a lot of like fish out of water stories, is that you kind of get old to the idea of the fish out of water type of comedy. There's a lot of that in this movie, and some of the jokes do work, some of the jokes don't. Although the jokes that did work for me were sometimes when like it would go into like a stereotypical like Disney fairy tale movie, and then it would just like contradict it. For example, like towards the beginning, Eleanor's trying to sing and she gets like a pillow thrown at her face. I was like, that's kind of funny, but also kind of sad at the same time. Definitely decently directed. I like the character work. I like the message it's trying to send out to people. And also, it even has this whole thing where, love is something that's not just a thing of like man, woman get together. It's sometimes love can be the ones that you have in your life, whether it be your kids, whether it be your husband if you're gay and have like an adoptive child, like various other things. And this movie overall asks us what we love in our lives that makes us happy, and that is a good message to have, to be honest. And I think we need more messages like that after we get out of this whole pandemic shit. So yeah, so in the end, I'm gonna give Godmothered a B. Thank you guys so much for watching my reviews for Mank and Godmothered. I'll be sure to have some more reviews out soon, like Trial of Chicago 7 and Queen's Gambit and Palm Springs, a couple more movies here and there. But at the same time, I am working on my Christmas episode. So that's going to be fun. So I hope you guys will stay tuned for that, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.